Hi, God bless you, and welcome to our class today. And um, Today we're going to talk a little bit about intercultural finesse. Now, what do I mean by intercultural finesse? Well, this means knowing how to speak and relate to people. And this is something that we struggle with sometimes because different personalities, different approaches to things. Those of you who are missionaries know how important it is to master this ability to have finesse in relationships. Finesse, the spelling is Finesse. And when we think of finesse, I think of an early missionary to Korea. Her name is Lilias Horton Underwood. Now, she was a medical doctor. She also was involved with early Bible studies. She also was very supportive of her husband, Horace Underwood, who started Chosun Medical College, which became Yonhee University and ultimately Yonsei. So we see this lady named Lilias Horton Underwood, and I want to talk a little bit about her life as an example of exercising intercultural finesse. Uh, the first thing we need to look at is she had many struggles. She arrived in Korea and did not know the language at all. So she was at a complete disadvantage. She knew she wanted to evangelize the country as best she could and to support missions there. So, in order to do that, she had a lot of initiative. So, if you are in an intercultural setting, you need to have initiative. You need to have a strong desire to carry on the work. She did a lot of informal education and she had some very wonderful teaching methodologies. So I want to share that with you. She was very sensitive about relationships, very sensitive about public face. She wanted to put her best foot forward and do what she could to preserve the image of Christianity. Keep in mind, in Korea at that time, Christianity was just getting started. I mean, there had been some exposure through China and through some missionaries before, but things were just getting started. And also, it was a very tough road because the Korean government, too, at the time, discouraged this sort of evangelism. She very much valued personal relationships. And she also was very much a person who felt there should be a balance of power. Now, when I say that, I mean she served everyone. She had a heart for improving the status of women in Korea. So she associated with women and children, and yet she also became close to the Queen of Korea. And this gives you an idea of the range of people that she was involved with. So the Queen at the time, probably the most powerful woman in Korea, she associated with her, but she also associated with people with more humble backgrounds. She was constantly interpreting relationships. So she did not make assumptions about people. And when I read writings that she did, and there may be other writings that people may disagree with the way she was, but she seems to have been someone who constantly reinterpreted relationships. So I think there's a lesson for us, for those of us who value intercultural education, that people are always changing and we should not make a judgment about a person, and we should be open to looking at other people in terms of how they've changed. And I always say other people. I'm not just talking about in the intercultural setting, even in our own families. People change, and we need to allow for that. We cannot make judgments. So we must, in a word, reinterpret relationships all the time. Lily has had a great respect for the culture. She tried not to impose her way, even though she was spreading a new thing, the gospel of Christ, new for many. She really respected the culture that was happening in Korea. She was also, as all missionaries know, very adaptable. She was willing to learn more and willing to change. And that's important. And she was also very flexible. She, of course, was bringing the gospel to Korea, not only through Bible studies, but through the way she conducted herself. She was very public relations oriented. She knew that she was being watched. So everything she did not want to embarrass Christianity as a religion and as a way of life. So everything she did was geared toward leaving a good impression of Christianity and showing the love of Christ in everything she did. And as an intercultural educator, we should always have long-term vision, and this is something that Lily has had. She was not there on a short-term mission trip, which they're great, and seeds are planted, and praise the Lord for short-term missions. But she made a decision that she was going to be there for life, and she gave her life for Korea. And she had a special, as I said, concern for the women. She felt many women were not treated well, and she, in her eyes, and she did what she could to improve the status of women. She also associated herself with institutions. So, that could be a school, it could be, her family, the Underwoods, being involved with higher education. So it was, and she was also part of the Presbyterian Church. So she attached herself with institutional things, the Presbyterian Church, missions organizations, supporting her husband in creating a Christian college, this sort of thing. So and also hospitals, of course. She was a physician, and she was the personal physician to the Queen. She also spent time at the palace, so she also was connected to the palace as an institution. Now, we talk about to be intercultural educators, we also need to have self-reflection to know where we came from. And Lilius attended the Albany Female Seminary, which is now called Albany Academy for Girls. This is the oldest girls' day school in the United States, and continuously run day school in the United States. My sisters went there, and it's known for progressive education, very confident women, very academic, and once again, people having a far-reaching vision, not being complacent. People don't sit back. So I think we are influenced by where we went to school. If you went to Seoul National University, you may have kind of a way that is reflected in the way you are and the way you act. If you went to a Presbyterian seminary, that is going to help shape your behavior. So this, in intercultural education, I think we want to know where we came from and how we got there. This has a big influence. So once again, repeating about Lilius, long-term vision, being very adaptable. serving the most powerful woman in Korea was quite quite something. And when she arrived there, she of course had to get used to the royal life. She had a lot of respect for the queen. She was always bowing, and she kind of became a friend of the queen. And I know when she first was allowed to actually speak to her, some members of the royal court were like, "Wow, you're talking with the queen," because sometimes not everyone could talk to the queen. So, but God put her in that position, and she cared about humble people, but she cared about the queen. She felt the queen had a very difficult life, and a lot of people would think, "Wow, a queen. What problems would a queen have?" But Queen Min, she had to go through a lot, and she ultimately, of course, was murdered. But when you are involved in intercultural settings, you do have to watch your every move. Kindness and love are a big part of what you do. Now, Lilias went on her honeymoon with her husband, Horace Underwood, and they traveled all over Korea. And on this honeymoon, she had been apparently one of the first Western women to go inside of Korea. So she was a curiosity. People were always looking at her. And the queen did not want her to go on this long honeymoon and really discouraged her from going. But she and her husband really wanted to go, so ultimately the queen said, "Okay, you can go, and I will give you a letter, anything you need along the way." But everyone said it's very dangerous to go on this kind of a journey. There are robbers, bandits. It's very dangerous for you to go on this trip, but they still went. So it was a honeymoon trip, although it was also a time of evangelism. Some people debate whether that was a good thing that she did, because once again, the government discouraged evangelism. So you may have your own opinion about that. I don't know. But she wanted to show the love of Christ. And at that time, it was considered rude for a woman to be seen during the day. So when they traveled, she had to travel in a sedan chair. So some strong guys were carrying her in this chair that had curtains, and she had to travel this way. Well, as predicted, her entourage, the group that was traveling on this trip, were robbed. There were these tough guys who robbed her group that was traveling. So there was this big robbery. And now the guys who were carrying her were very upset about that, and they wanted to go out after the robbers and really have a fight with them and a confrontation, like, "Why are you robbing us? These big burly guys that were carrying Lilias around, they were very mad, and they wanted to chase those robbers and get into a big fight." Well, Lilias said, "No, don't do that. Please do not do that." Because she said, "We are showing the love of Christ, and part of showing the love of Christ is demonstrating forgiveness." So this was a powerful witness. And remember, she was very new to Korea, but yet she had this, what I call, intercultural finesse. She did not want to compromise the reputation of Christianity. She once again had this long-term vision. So when we think of intercultural finesse, it's about relationships, it's about sensitivity, it's about public face. So listening is responding is a very important concept when we think about Lilias Horton Underwood. And she responded well to the world that she was in. And I think we have to be good listeners and good watchers to really know how to respond the right way. So, in modern day Christianity, to switch the subject for at the moment, we need to have this kind of finesse in all relationships. And sometimes it's a challenge because we have identities that are changing. Now, I think of Dr. Sharon Kim, who is a sociologist who researched Korean American churches in Southern California. And she talks about hybrid churches and adapting to culture, and churches that relate with the community in their own way. And it may not be exclusively quote unquote Korean or quote unquote non-Korean. It's this constant creation of a church that is going to serve God in a big way. Now this, along with this comes a term that I have coined, and that is called identity in flux. Identity in flux. What does flux mean? That means something that is changing and maybe going in and out. So, as intercultural people, people that understand intercultural theory and we have intercultural experience, we need to realize that our identity is constantly going in and out. So this identity in flux, and that's okay. Sometimes it's for personal survival, sometimes it's for curiosity. So if we were going to a Korean-speaking church, and we might go, well, I want to go to an English-speaking church. Well, we may go to that English-speaking church and say, oh, I miss the Korean-speaking church where I'm going to have lunch after church, and I miss that atmosphere. So there's this going in and out, and we call it identity in flux. And if we are serving in the field, we see this same thing, where identities are constantly changing and being readjusted. This is a good thing because people can learn about this new culture, that new culture, but also can return to the security and the familiarness of the quote-unquote original culture. There is not one way, okay? There is not one way to do this. But we need to understand that we can go in and out like waves in the ocean about how we are getting involved with different cultural situations. So we need to know how to balance our communication. If you're in the field right now and you're speaking with maybe a culture you haven't dealt with very much, but that communication involves having intercultural finesse. In my doctoral program at Biola, I remember speaking with or hearing a professor speak, and he grew up in America, and he was in the doctoral program, but he also was serving as a professor at a university in China. And he was a nice person, but he told the story of him being very rude by using what he considered an acceptable style of communication. And he was trying to figure out what his assignment was going to be, where he was going to be teaching at the university. And in China, maybe in this particular setting, they did not really know what his schedule was going to be or how it was going to go. And that's fine. That's fine. And if he had had more of an understanding of the dynamics of that Chinese location, he would have said, as we say in English, go with the flow, see what happens, don't worry about it. But he was not interculturally sophisticated yet. He hadn't reached that level of understanding. So he made a big intercultural mistake, really big. He went to the university and he became impatient. And he was like, well, why can't I know my schedule? Blah, 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 blah. So from his standpoint, he thought somehow that was the way to communicate. And it was not good, because after that, he damaged all the relationships. They remembered him as being this pushy guy who wanted to know what he wanted to know. And he realized that he had made a huge mistake, that his style was not a good style. So we need to be conscious of how our actions might be interpreted. But he learned from that, and actually God used that experience, and when he shared it in our doctoral class, we learned a lot from that. So that was really amazing. I think in intercultural education, we need to, language becomes a big part of all of this. If we are communicating in a language that is not our own, we struggle with that. Like, how am I going to relate? How am I going to talk? How am I going to sound? If you're someone who is trying to improve your English, I want to give you some advice. And this is, I think, really important. And, language proficiency, being proficient in a language, that's not important, okay? Now you might say, oh, it is important. I want to say, yes. Okay, yes, if you've studied English, you've studied it formally, you understand, you've learned the grammar, maybe you've learned some of the writing, some communication skill, that's great. But I believe when it comes to intercultural communication, it's having what I call godly communication, letting your speech be governed by the Holy Spirit. Anyone can learn about nouns and verbs and adverbs, but not everyone can have godly communication. Yes, you can have both, but even if language is not perfect, that you consider not perfect, it's the godly communication. What does your face look like? What is your heart saying? Heart is stronger than words. Heart is stronger than words. So this is important to know. We, of course, are based in the Los Angeles area. And within the Los Angeles area, we have over 230 languages represented. And when you think of LA, you might say, well, there's Korean, there's Chinese, there's English, and all these other languages. But there are so many smaller, languages that maybe might be an Indian language from Mexico, or a variation of Vietnamese, whatever it may be. So there are many, many languages here in LA, the LA area. So it's important this is almost like a laboratory, I think, when you see people relating to one another. We have to show courtesy and understanding. And not only that, we have to be open to learning. It's wonderful. It's wonderful, the learning that happens here. And God is so good. Intercultural education oftentimes is about reconciliation. There's a professor here who talks about reconciliation a lot, and it makes sense because there could be representations of two cultures. Maybe there's a history of difficult times. So we should always seek this kind of reconciliation, because that is godly communication. That is showing the love of Christ in relationships. So this is very important, and communicating is ministering. Okay, people may be a minister, they may not be a minister, but when you can communicate in a way that transforms, that teaches, that shares, this is really what I consider good intercultural communication, and growing, and also knowing how to handle the unexpected. Because you may meet someone and you expect them to be a certain way, and they may be meeting you and they expect you to be a certain way, and then maybe you're both acting in a way you expect. We call that expectation violation theory. And this means that what do we do if someone is not, communicating in the way you expect? Well, you have to be ready for that. And if that happens, it's okay, because that person may be trying to show love for you, godly communication and love toward you, and you are trying to do the same thing. You're trying to understand one another. So we have to know how to shift a little bit. Oh, he didn't do that. I thought he would. Or she didn't, oh, she didn't say that. Or I'm. So we have to we have to think on our feet. And if we make a mistake, or we don't know what to expect, that's the excitement of communication. That shows maturity in communicating. Well, this happened. Oh, what do I do now? Oh, I can get through this. I can have some kind of a response. And of course, it depends on what is being talked about or what has happened, what the relationship is. But one thing that never changes, it never changes in Christian communication. We are always showing the love of Christ, always. So that's something, if we use that as our primary lesson in our communication, in intercultural circles, in any circle, family, business, church, travel, if the number one part of our communication is expressing the love of Jesus Christ, we are always going to be okay. So we have talked about intercultural finesse, and a little bit, we talked about Lilias Horton Underwood and how she used it, and what it's like in LA a little bit, in the LA area. So thank you so much, and God bless you, and I appreciate your ideas so much, and thank you so much. God bless.